Okay, good afternoon, everybody who's joined. Welcome to this webinar. We will run in a minute or so through till 1 o'clock. My name is Charles Stewart. I'm one of the directors of the Institute of Interim Management. I'm the host for today. The webinar will be presented by Simon Hudson, who you can see also from Morphosis Partners. Just to point out that the webinar will be recorded, so that's for everybody's use afterwards. If you object to that, then I'm afraid you will have to leave the call, but that will be made available to you as well within a few days normally. So without further ado, one last point, please, as we go, put your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom. We are currently up to about 14 people, so it's just on the edges of too many for opening up to chat. So into the Q&A button, we'll try and pause at appropriate points to take those questions, and then there'll be time later on as well. So, so if that's clear, over to you, Simon.
Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody, and thank you for choosing this webinar as opposed to tuning into the budget talk, which I think is due to go at 12:30. So if we get a drop-off rate at around the 12:30 mark, I'll know why. So we've got to get out of jail card at that moment. But thank you for joining. The topic today is fairly straightforward in principle, which is how to go about attaining assignment acquisition success with a specific view towards the interim professional. And what I would try and prompt and urge is really just for you to think about that statement and how you may be feeling in respect to that. So, you know, questions in the Q&A, it's an opportunity really for you to pick my brains, and the questions that you're likely to have are likely to be questions that other participants are likely to share. So do please flag up the questions and we'll do our best to go through them as we proceed. So without further ado, to give you a couple of prompts. So this is about helping to stimulate questions really, so that we can make sure it's as beneficial to you as is possible. So what is it about the topic that's brought you here today? What may have been playing on your mind? Are you seeing changes in the marketplace? Are you feeling particularly challenged by certain aspects of how you go about seeking the assignment? And do please cite those in the Q&A section, and then we'll either pick them up as we proceed or we'll leave them towards the end, depending. So please interact with the Q&A. In terms of Morphosis Partners and the IIM, you know, who are Morphosis Partners? What do we do? In simple form, if you can relate to anything on the left, then Morphosis Partners are likely to have a relevance to you, as indicated on the right. So we're not a substitute to recruiters, we're not a substitute to the IIM, we are a partner to the IIM. And in certain cases, we are also a partner to the recruitment marketplace, whether that be interim service providers or end employers or the advisors that sit in the middle. But our approach is quite unique because we essentially work on behalf of the individual. That's our primary interest. And so what may be interesting to stimulate is whether any of those attending today's webinar can relate to anything that's currently centered on the left of that table, or indeed there could be something that we've missed off. So by all means do share that. In terms of why it's worth your time in listening, there's just a few sort of testimonies of individuals who have gained the value and the experience of Morphosis Partners. Some of them have engaged on some of the seminars which we specifically put together in partnership with the Institute of Interim Management, and others, as we'll share here, have had more of a one-to-one journey or program with us. So it just gives you an idea that as far as Morphosis Partners are concerned, we're experienced at what we do, and hence we are a partner to the Institute of Interim Management. So just setting the scene here, one of the things that Morphosis Partners have been quite privy to, I suppose, is that with every interim professional that we've supported, they generally engage with the diagnostic at the start, so a gap analysis. So we're able to interpret their starting position. And more importantly, when they go through those seminars with us or those one-to-one programs, we can see the end game, the end result. And that gives us quite a rich set of data from which we can uncover certain trends. And what we've put in a table format here are just some of the, I suppose, more interesting insights for us. And this has been brought up to date to the end of 2023. So this has evolved since the last presentation that we did roughly 3-4 months ago. So what can we see here? What is worth highlighting or pointing out? Be interesting to see where your own eyes are drawn here. But from my perspective, I think one of the interesting things is around the actual, say, LinkedIn activity. LinkedIn has clearly grown and it's manifested. And for most people, it would be right to think that LinkedIn has a place and it has a place to support the interim professional. But what is quite interesting is just the relative level of activity that a typical interim professional who seems to be acquiring assignment opportunities on a fairly regular basis, how they behave relative to those who potentially have more of a challenging time in terms of landing assignment opportunities. The key message there is that there's a lot of noise on LinkedIn, for example, that would imply that you've got to be writing content, you've got to be there all the time, etc., etc. And it almost fuels this intention, I suppose, that you've got to become a prolific content creator. From my experience and the experience of the clients that we've supported, if it goes beyond a certain level of activity, it can actually start to work against you. And that's quite interesting. So one of the key messages on that particular aspect is to think about almost the stereotype of the persona for what it is that you are. So, for example, if you're an interim chief finance officer, let's say, does the stereotype image of that look like somebody who would be writing lots of articles, lots of content on a hour by hour daily basis on LinkedIn? Not necessarily. It almost looks like they become a social media influencer as opposed to an interim CFO. So there's almost like a word of caution where LinkedIn is concerned. And the activity, of course, that somebody has on LinkedIn becomes an audit trail. So you've also got to be fairly conscious about what you're saying and how it may be interpreted. And on the point on that table, again, just in terms of questions for later, it'll be interesting to see whether, you know, for those who are on this webinar, your eyes are drawn to a particular statistic or observation here that may form the basis of a question that you may have. So I'll move on from that. Okay, so all of our data points from all of the individuals that we work with translate into 5 derailers or choke points that, if not managed effectively, can unseat an interim executive's ability to procure sustainable assignment opportunities. So what are they? On the right-hand side here, we will see 5 things. Effective use of LinkedIn, correct alignment with ISPs, and for those not familiar with that terminology, that stands for interim service providers. So they are recruitment parties or businesses that support interims either full-time, or there will be a part of their business that supports interim mandates and assignment opportunities. Then we have existing network navigation, ability to go direct to companies. And then the interesting one for me is actually the competence to win the selection process, which is the one that most of the clients that we've supported have generally come to us with a very confident view about, but is typically an area that they end up gaining most value on, which is quite surprising given their views ahead of working with us. So it'll be interesting to see again whether these 5 areas give you any prompts in terms of thoughts or questions. So the interim job market is a big ecosystem. And one of the interesting things here is about the use of the term interim. If you were to go onto LinkedIn, for example, and in your top left search bar, put the word in interim and then select people, it comes up with 1.97 million people who, as part of their tagline or as part of a job title they've held at some point in their employment history, the word interim is referenced or used. Now, this is getting a wry smile from Charles because, what we understand by that is that there's clearly an awful lot of people who are using that term but aren't actually interim, not in the truest sense or definition of the word. And what that means is it's presenting an air of confusion in the landscape. And so one of the key things that as an interim professional you've got to be minded of is your ability almost to educate your intended audience, because some people will confuse interim for fixed term contract. It's not the same. Some people will confuse interim for consultancy. It's not the same. But what it does mean is that if I, for example, am a lay employer and I think I need somebody to come into my business to deliver a high impact solution over a shorter period of time, when I put the word in, I think I need an interim professional, I could get consultants, I can get contractors. And so from my point of view, it actually makes it quite challenging for me as the employer, as the buyer of said services. So there is an air of caution around making sure that when it comes to this job market, you position yourself within it appropriately. And what I mean by that is in a way that enables you to stand out within this crowd. Because actually true interims are worth their weight in gold. But if you're confused in the melee of 1.97 million, then in actual fact, it becomes more difficult to get heard, which then may counter my argument on the previous data slide, which is, but actually those who do best at this are the ones who create less content. So how do you get the balance right is one of the things we'll be going into. So LinkedIn is quite interesting. And one of the things that you need to be minded of with LinkedIn is not just having your picture and your badge or your tagline and uploading of your experience, but within LinkedIn, have you actually tried to find yourself on LinkedIn? So what do I mean by that? So let's say I'm a recruiter or a headhunter or an ISP, and I've got a company who says, right, I need an interim supply chain expert. And let's say, or procurement expert, and let's say that I'm not aware of Charles by name or reputation, who happens to be a pretty good interim procurement and supply chain expert, probably more procurement. So apologies if I'm slightly off on that. But let's say that the perfect person for me happens to be Charles, but I'm not aware of Charles. So I go onto LinkedIn, what do I do? So the first thing I do as that ISP is think, right, who do I know and who have I placed before? Who is soon to come off assignment that I can tap up and move them to the next gig? And let's say that all of those people are currently engaged. So then I've got to scratch my head and go, okay, so what do we do next? Well, what you do next is, let's say you'll go onto LinkedIn and you'll go into that search bar and you will put interim, procurement, whatever. So the question then is, have you actually done a search of that type to see, A, whether you get found for that, and secondly, where within the pecking order you are found for that? And separate to the offer that we will give to people at the end of this webinar, if anybody would like for me to do a test to see whether they can currently be found on LinkedIn for what it is they wish to be found for, then I'll happily extend to anybody on this webinar a 15-minute conversation where you can tell me what you're hoping to be found for. We can do the search and we can see where you come up on that search. Interestingly enough, we are generally at around 15 to 20% of people who are able to be found for what it is they intend to be found for on LinkedIn. It's an exceptionally low, surprising number. And the tool we use for that isn't your standard LinkedIn subscription. It's things like Recruiter Lite, which is what the recruitment and the ISP businesses use, or if it's an employer, they may well do a similar search using Sales Navigator, which are both additional subscription-based services to complement LinkedIn. Of note, 2 or 3 of the key areas where people falter on being found. So for example, let's say I put interim procurement in. Let's say that comes up with, I don't know, 20,000 people globally. Then clearly I'm then going to focus on location just to bring the number down. And let's say that brings it down to, I don't know, 1,000 for London, just for argument's sake. That's too many profiles for me to look at. So then I'm going to filter again, usually on a particular trait that that employer is seeking. So for example, that employer may be seeking somebody with sector-based experience, just for argument's sake. So let's say that sector is manufacturing. So all of those filters will then bring it down to a reasonable number, and that reasonable number will then get looked at. So your aim, if you're going to sit and use LinkedIn, is to think about what those filters are likely to be for your own interest, and to make sure that your LinkedIn profile supports that, so that within that smaller audience of say 50 profiles or 100 profiles, that you're in the mix. What we've found when we've done these searches for people are one of 3 typical issues. One issue that will unseat people's ability to be found is location. So for example, if you're sat up, let's say in Aberdeen, and your location is set to Aberdeen, and I'm looking for this procurement person to be sat in London, I'm likely to put the location filter in for where that role is, unless it's entirely hybrid or remote. So you're immediately deselected without even being known, simply because of the location issue. The next one that catches a lot of people out is industry. And industry is quite an interesting one, because it's not your profile that sets you to an industry. It's how the employers that you've worked for define themselves. So for example, from the world I used to be in as a headhunter, you know, some of the firms that I used to work for do not classify themselves on LinkedIn as a staffing and recruitment business. One of my former employers calls themselves a management consultancy firm. So you can easily get caught out by the way that those employers that you've worked for label themselves. So again, let's say that you've been attached to manufacturing, but I'm looking for somebody in mechanical engineering, and that becomes the filter. So how do you counter that if that's the audience that you're now trying to gravitate to? So these are the kinds of things that you've got to be thinking about, but secondly, you've got to look to correct, because they could be the very reason why you're not necessarily getting the volume of calls that you would otherwise like to have or would expect. So do bear that in mind. So my summary here is, simply being on LinkedIn does not mean you will be found amongst 940 million profiles. So if you're going to be on LinkedIn, use it in the most effective way. And again, if there are any questions specific to LinkedIn, or anybody would like to have that 15-minute search to see whether they can be found, then do please reach out or offer the prompt in the Q&A. So now we need to talk about ISPs, or the interim service providers. The Institute of Interim Management, the IIM, do an annual survey which effectively goes out to existing interim professionals and gains data from them around their experiences in that previous year. One of the key areas that gets looked at is the source of their previous assignment. And through that, one of the areas is a ranking of the interim service providers. And I'm sure Charles will talk about that towards the end and what the IIM does. But what's quite interesting in that, just to give you an idea about where people can be unseated with ISPs, is we tend to find, again, one of 2 or 3 things. The first thing that we find is that some people can be connected to the right firm, but not the right individual within the firm. Now, that may seem fairly obvious, but that can have quite a significant impact, because it's likely that the right person in the right firm could have the right mandate, but expecting them to, speak to their colleague and say, by the way, I need an interim procurement person. Do you know anybody? It would be great if they worked like that. But certainly from my own experience in that world, it's generally a team of individuals rather than a team. So, and people do evolve their careers just as you will evolve yours. So it's worth double checking how your recruitment contacts in the ISP world have migrated. So if they were once upon a time placing procurement people, but now they've shifted to, I don't know, telecom engineers or whatever it may be, then of course you've got to realign to the right individual. And that may seem fairly obvious, but when you're busy and you've got lots of things to juggle in terms of work life and home life, it can easily be an area where you forget to give it that consideration. The second thing I would say with ISPs really revolves around the way by which people look to engage them, to bring them into the networks of each other. I've attended a number of webinars where ISPs have been either the lead speakers or have participated with them. And a couple of things really seem to come to mind in terms of the feedback that we hear from ISPs, which is, it really annoys me when I never hear from that interim professional until they need the next assignment. And then suddenly out of the blue, I get a short, curt message which says, hello, Bob, not heard from you for a while. By the way, have you got any assignments? I'm now available. It's a relationship that needs to be vested into, because actually they are worth their weight in gold once it's nurtured. And it's not just nurture once and then forget about it. It has to be retained, because in busy dynamic marketplaces, recruiters can easily start to forget people's availability and who may be good for what, despite the best CRM systems, etc. So one of the things I would urge is to think about, are you aligned to the right individuals within the right firm? And for those that you can say yes, how are you managing your relationship with them? Because when I was headhunting and recruiting interim and permanent professionals, and I got a mandate from the client, and I'm in that conversation with them, the first thing I think about right at the start of that call is, who do I know? You've got to be the person on that radar. And you'll see at that second bullet point, we use the acronym of MPC. That means most placeable candidate. And you may think that that would mean the person who is technically the brightest, the most able, the person who is like the Mekon, if ever any of you read the Eagle comic as a youngster. The Mekon was the all-knowing being. He had a funny shaped head, in fairness, but it's because of the size of his brain, clearly. But the point is that if you're not that most placeable candidate, you can easily be overlooked. Because if I'm looking for that interim procurement person and I've got Charles in mind because it's a pharmaceutical or life science business, I'm straight on the phone to him. Now, we may say, sorry, I'm still on assignment, you're going to have to wait. But then I'm going to say, well, look, okay, that's fine. But do you know anybody who's a bit like you, who you rate? And then he will say, well, actually, I know this chap or this lady that you may want to reach out to. And it becomes based then on reputation-based referral. When Charles maintaining his relationship with this recruiter, he's not going to suggest or promote somebody that he's not prepared to put his own reputation against. So therefore, generally, those types of referrals are amongst the strongest and the most preferred when it comes to how ISPs operate. So there's a couple of action points there in terms of things to think about. And again, if anybody's got any questions related to engagement of ISPs, then do please offer some question in. So the next challenge we get is this idea of existing network. And generally what happens in the profile of an interim professional is that they've tended to have a permanent career before. They probably enter the interim world usually in their 40s, mid to late 40s, once they've hit the dizzy heights in the corporate world. And what happens over 5 years or 10 years or more of being that interim professional is that they are so busy on assignment and getting the next assignment that by the time they suddenly hit that cattle grid and they go, oh, my network's not bringing me the next assignment to my door. What do I do? They then start to think about their existing network. And what happens is they go to that network and they'll go, well, Bob used to be a good guy. I'll reach out. Oh, he's retired. Oh, right. Okay. Sharon, fantastic person. Oh, she's now in a sector that I'm no longer relatable to or interested in. And you start to find that your existing network depletes for fairly obvious reasons. And the issue with that is that when you look typically at how you have procured opportunities in your career to date, as much as ISPs do have a weighting and they maintain a certain segment in terms of assignment opportunities that they fill, a greater number actually fill through your existing network, or certainly from our findings in terms of what Morphosis Partners do. So it's important that you learn to understand not just who do you have in your network today that is relevant for where you are now, but actually who is relevant in terms of supporting that journey that I'm intent on going down. And how do you then look to maintain that relationship with them? And in the same context as an ISP, they don't want to hear from you with the first message after 5 years, which is, have you got any jobs? You know, how would you respond to that? Do you respond to that? So it's not about having a full-time job networking. It's about understanding within the network you've got, who are the few that are forward supportive. And we term that a future-facing network. And that network needs to comprise, if you want to be sustainable as an interim executive, that network needs to comprise 3 different types of people. The first type of person are the interim service providers, the relevant people. And they will evolve as you evolve. So that's one category. The next category are people within your network who are aligned to your intended sector of interest. And typically they will be individuals who are positioned above you in a decision-making authority. So for the average interim professional, that network type profile is going to be somebody like a group level equivalent of yourself in terms of your own expertise, or possibly in a smaller business, the chief exec or indeed the chairman. In fact, the last few clients that we've supported, it's been the chairman that we've been looking to engage more specifically. And then the third group are the people who kind of connect these opportunities together outside of the recruiters and the end client. And this I'm referring to as advisors, corporate strategists, private equity people. So for example, within private equity, depending on your interest and relevance there, it's not just a case of, for example, hello BGF or Business Growth Fund, and connecting to anybody within that business of 300 to 400 people. Within BGF, as an example, you've got to understand the mechanics of the roles that those individuals perform. So, for example, if you're an interim and you see private equity as a relevant market for you, then there are 3 types of people that you want to be looking to curate within your existing network. One, are you connected to any investment partners who actually have the board advisor or the NED role within a business within a sector of relevance to you? So in the case of Charles with BGF, are BGF invested in any life science businesses or pharmaceutical businesses? Because that would be the person who's more likely to have an active interest in you. And that person is relevant both from a due diligence, pre-acquisition, to the performance during the time that they are invested in terms of their interest, and potentially at the exit point, if that's the nature of the profile of the service. But that's just one individual of 3 you need to be thinking about. The second one to think about are the people who hold talent network keys. And if I look at one of the biggest shifts I've seen across private equity are the number of PE firms that are now working hard to build their own networks of talent and bench-based experts that they will go to first and foremost when a portfolio business has a need. And it's only if that is dry that they will then look to engage the recruiters. And what I've seen is a PE firm now competing against an ISP to fill the same role. and I'm seeing more of that happening. So when you're on the radar of the firm directly, so within BGF, you've got a head of talent network, you've got it's the other chap that does it. They're the people that you need to become visible to. And then the third person is really about where do your skills within the business cycle have greatest applicability. So if you're really good at due diligence and helping the investment partner to understand, does it make sense? Then your third person may well be the head of origination, who's looking at these prospects of opportunities. Equally, you may be the kind of person who's actually better at working within the business once it's in play, and that they've sort of observed it for a year, and then they've decided they want to deliver some transformative actions, whether it be new ERP or whatever it may be. And at that point, your third person would be the head of growth or value creation. So, and then there's the third person, for another person who says, well, actually, I'm just quite good across the mix within this. I can probably dabble at the due diligence end. I'm probably quite capable in the mid-flight of an opportunity. And actually, I'm probably quite useful at getting a business readying for exit. In which case, your person would be the head of portfolio or the portfolio performance partner. So again, within that existing network, how well are you gaining that coverage across those environments that are relevant to you? Because what we empower and enable individuals to do is to do this, which is to go direct. And it doesn't mean that recruitment companies are displaced or missed out. So I'll give you a very recent example of somebody where we approached the business. We actually approached the chairman of this business because we could see in the news that they were in a, dare I say, a bit of a flat spin. And therefore, that to me said, anybody who's quite good at turnaround may well be relevant to that business. Yeah. So that was the common sense, the logic that stimulated the approach. And when we approached the chairman simply turned around and said, actually, the guy you're looking to introduce potentially has relevance to us at this point in time, but we're actually engaged with a recruitment partner. Oh, great. Who? Actually, it was Spencer Stewart in this example. And the chairman basically said, look, so tell your guy to reach out to Spencer Stewart. And I just turned around to the chairman and said, well, yeah, I could do that. But actually, my role is to introduce our client to you to be an extension of your network. So my suggestion is, why don't you have a meet and greet? And if the opportunity still bears relevance from that introduction, by all means, why don't you introduce them to Spencer Stewart when it comes to your update chat with them? And guess what? They did that. And Spencer Stewart then obviously just automatically put him in the shortlist for consideration because the person paying Spencer Stewart had obviously given them that dictate. So it doesn't mean that by going direct, you're somehow doing a disservice. What you're actually doing is strengthening your ability to enhance your look factor of being victorious through those processes. Now, by doing that, you can only go direct if you know where to start. And to know where to start, you've actually got to become quite focused. And for a lot of interim executives, particularly those who have had a broader range of experience, they often feel that their skills are transferable and they can take the hand to a wide variety of things. Now, in a loose market, a buoyant market, that works okay. But if you actually look at how the market's been behaving over the last, let's say, 18 months, in fact, post-COVID, to be honest, there's been a few, little nuggets of growth, but actually it seems a lot more static and somber and, in certain markets, it doesn't work so well. So, because actually human behavior is hardwired to choosing the easiest, most comfortable choice. Effectively, it's based on comfort. So when it comes to, do I go for the person who's saying, I'd love to do that, I've got transferable skills, it's not too far removed from what I've done before, let me have a go, I'll be fine? Or do they actually go, I hear what you're saying, you're a nice person, but my neck's on the block here, and I've got to turn this thing around. So this guy who's been in automotive for 15 years and has already got a bit of a track record of similar problems and challenges and situations, I'm going to back that person. And it's back to the old analogy that nobody ever got fired for choosing I forget what it was, the salesperson from IBM or something. But it's that kind of analogy. And it is so relevant and true within within the interim professional community. In fact, it's probably more the case within the interim community because you're being appointed to deliver on a time-based issue, challenge, or indeed opportunity. So it's not always to the negative construct. Often interims are employed to support a positive intention, whether it be growth or other. So you've got to think about that. And to make this your home and to go direct, by being focused, what happens is your audience becomes finite. And as I'll share with some of our successes, that the more focused you are, and you then don't have to get distracted by a scattergun approach or just it's a numbers game nonsense, that can all get thrown out of the window and you can actually just behave as that leadership interim, and play exactly to that stereotype. So again, it'll be interesting if anybody's got questions about that particular element or whether they've tried it and what successes or failures they may or may not have had with that. Be quite curious to know. And then the final point is really about winning at selection. So when we've met with people, we see people who are very impressive, subject matter experts, often very engaging, but sometimes they also recognize that they may have had a few interim assignments where they were kind of tapped on the shoulder, or because of reputation, they kind of got the phone call. And I'm not saying that they didn't have to go through a selection process of some form, but if you've got the reputation, you've got the advocacy, and a bit of a, sort of brand name, I suppose, for being the go-to guy for said solution, those assignments are often procured and won a bit more easily. So what if you find yourself in a situation where, let's say, your existing networks become progressively depleted, you're not really aligned with the right ISPs, so your relationships are very formative with them, so you're a less of a known entity, and you just simply click apply to an opportunity. That selection process for that person is going to be far harder. And it's far harder either because you've got a CV that's got to work its magic through an applicant tracking system if they're used. I know plenty of companies and recruiters who don't use ATS because actually, they're still a work in progress would be the polite tone of phrase I would give for those systems. But for those that do, it puts an awful lot of pressure on a CV to be written in the right way, aligned to the right keywords, where you've been able to read the mind of the hiring parties and align those capabilities to that. Now, if you do get through that, fantastic, but you've then got to get through probably first meeting with the recruiter or a senior executive within the business. And often what you find with that first meeting is that you're being interviewed by somebody who's never done the job you've done before, nor have they done the job that is being selected for. Now that presents quite an interesting dynamic, which is what if you're going for an interim procurement job, and that first person who wants to meet and greet you is a HR person, just for argument's sake, because they want to do the cultural fit piece. And most interims would say, well, I'm here to deliver a task. I'm not here to fit the blend of your business for the next 10 years. So why are you that person that I'm coming to meet in first instance? The problem is if that's the order of play in that process, you've got to think about how you align language. Because if you go in there with all the rich successes and the jargon that comes with the territory of your expertise, that person at the other side of that table or Teams call will nod politely at you and go, I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue. I may have to Google that. What was that again? RAID? Don't quite know what that means. Right, I'll get that on Google. They're not going to admit to you that they don't know those things. So you've actually got quite an interesting challenge to go through. And that's why, certainly for me, I refer to this selection process as a game, because the people who win it, if you've not got the advocacy, or you've not got the referral into the business, or you've not got that reputational piece going for you, then you're effectively starting that 100-meter sprint 10, if not 20 meters behind the starting block. And therefore, the question that we pose to our clients is, have you been in that situation, and how have you appraised or assessed how well you're likely to perform in that situation? What's quite interesting is one of the modules we give people at the selection process piece is we actually give them a mock interview, but it has a twist. They get the mock interview. I actually get them to send me the questions that they would expect to be asked. I get them to give me a job spec that is perfectly aligned to their world, so there's no trying to trip them up. I then add a few questions to it. I send them back to them so they know the order of play. We then do the mock interview where I take the role of the potential company. And then the twist is that I actually then give them the scoring mechanism, but I get them to score themselves. So it's not me saying, haha, that was great or that was rubbish. It's, how did you think you fared? Great, let's go through the questions, let's go through the answers together. And then actually based on that feedback, they then give themselves a scoring. And what's quite interesting is that the interim clients we work with are slightly behind our permanent clients in terms of the scoring average. The average interim gets 34% on our mock interview on the first hit. The permanent people are at 41. Now, why is there that difference? Two things that we see. With permanent, they are typically on that linear trajectory in career. So there's less of a challenge about their experience because they either fit it or they don't. There's normally less of a downtime issue to deal with. You know, you're being off assignment for 2.5 years. Can you explain that? And then you dig a hole for yourself unnecessarily, or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of rabbit holes that potentially you can get taken down, which can essentially unseat somebody unnecessarily. And then the third thing I would say, which is quite interesting, is interims are so good with their proposition that sometimes they actually don't answer the question that's being asked because they're so used to autopilot around their capabilities. And when you've got a different audience, like a HR leader or a chairman, for example, who's saying, I'm losing money, I put my son into this family-owned business, I really don't want to sack him because he's third generation, but what do I do? Can you please help me? And let's say that help is around finance, or that help is around operational change, culture change, perhaps. You've got to be very careful about thinking about how you align your language to the audience, because if there's a misalignment, you could be the perfect person with the best expertise, but if they don't hear that and sense that and respond to that, you've got to disconnect. And that's why we say it's not about who's best at job that lands the job. It's the person either with the strongest network or reputation or advocacy, or if you want to beat those individuals, you just have to focus on aligning to your audience better, because you can do that very effectively within a selection process. So again, I'd be interested to know whether there are any questions specific about that. So in summary, when it comes to sustainable success, this is your checklist. And the interesting thing about this checklist is that nobody is drawing a challenge on your ability to do what it is that you are expert in. That is not on the checklist. But if you're going to be that interim CFO or that interim supply chain expert, you're going to be that based on your career to date. So that is not in question. The question is, how well can you play the game of actually positioning to most effectively find yourself in more of the right conversations at more of the right time? And if you're going to invest your time and energy in a particular engagement process, at least turn up to win it. Yeah. And a lot of people don't, partly because the ISPs have a very limited brief and that's not helpful, you know. So you've got all of these things to consider. And so the question with that is actually, against this checklist, how well prepared are you in light of what you may observe around the marketplace? You know, if you believe it's tight, if you believe your network's eroding, if you believe this, or the evidence is highlighting these, what are you doing? And it's the mindset of the interim. The interim's mindset is to look for the solution. So if any of these things are causing a disconnect in terms of momentum or quality of assignment or volume of assignment, then those are things that need to be looked at. So again, be interesting to see if there's any questions around that. But when you put these things together, I'm just going to zoom in on this a little, probably zoomed a bit too much there. But just some of the people who we've worked with and the impact of what we do. Now, what I've put on the left column here is really where the impact came from, the most significant impact came from. So this lady here had basically been off assignment for a period of 7 months. The calculated loss of income during that time in terms of opportunity loss of not being engaged was clearly accruing. And then we started working with that individual. But what was interesting is by, elevating and recognizing the disconnect around the interview, she actually landed the very next job that she went for. And what was quite compelling about that is based on the quality of that performance, she got quite an interesting uplift on the day rate as well, which is quite interesting. And then there's other individuals here, you know, so we've got this person who was a salesperson. And I said to him, I said, well, you know, surely the best impression you could give to a business as a sales-based performance improver would be to demonstrate that you know how to go direct, because surely that's the key thing that you're going to be tested upon. And what was very interesting is that for that person, we just simply said, look, here's your target list of companies based on the sectors and the segments that you've been most relevant to. And yet for 8 months, his behavior was wait for the recruiter to advertise a job and then click apply. What we basically did is said, well, why don't we just flip that on its head? It took us 3 weeks. That was it. And then he was back in role. So there's a variety of instances or triggers, I suppose, that can sort of leave people floundering unnecessarily. And so the mindset or the decision is, do I continue to allow it to flounder and accrue this loss of income and utilization, or do I then go to somebody, whether it's Morphosis or the IIM or another, who can effectively give me the bits that I'm missing, can help me to understand that, which is exactly the same process an interim does when he goes to a business. First thing you do is understand root cause, you know, and then you offer a roadmap. So again, interesting. So the final thing I would say is that it'll be interesting to see what questions we've got, if any, coming through. But if anybody recognizes or resonates with any of those disconnects or choke points, with the IIM, we've translated each choke point into 3 impact seminars. So each seminar lasts at least 2 hours. And then because this is about an action orientation, there is a requirement to prepare before and a bit of homework after each of those sessions. And for people who are on the webinar today, we are offering a significant concession to our standard fee on those, with an additional uplift that if individuals are interested in more than one of those seminars, that there's a progressive discount applicable. So effectively, if somebody says all 5 are right for me, you're essentially getting the last one with a 50% discount. So it's a significant offer. And for those who aren't IIM members today or yet, what I would say is if you do the maths between the incentive for those who are IIM members, it works out across the 5 as a £750 difference. which will more than cover what I'm sure Charles will go into in the next minute or two. So thank you for listening. And over to you, Charles, just to see if there's any questions that are coming through.
Yes, so there's a few. We've had a couple of people drop, so I'm going to skip to the questions I can see with people who are still on the call. In fact, so from Meg a little while ago, I'm new to the space. My main question is, how do I set up sustainable systems and habits in order to sustain my career in this space?
Wow, that's a
It'll
very
take you
good
more than 9
question.
minutes. Yeah.
You've given me the easy one first.
Yes.
I would say the first thing, your starting point, really. In fact, I don't know whether you attended the webinar of a couple of weeks ago, which was You're Thinking of Becoming an Interim, and it was an introduction to the Institute of Interim Management. That talks about a number of things, such as first about consideration of mindset, what your drivers are for this, appreciating that there is an expectation of uptime, i.e. you're on assignment, and downtime. And once you've reconciled that you are happy with that, then the general order of play is you need to set yourself up as a trading company. Normally that is a requirement, unless you want to go down the fixed term contract type route, which is not truly the definition of interim. And then it's about understanding what your shop window is. So you don't need a grandiose investment in things like your own website to get yourself started. Your LinkedIn profile will do the same, and you can add a company profile page. And I would also recommend and advise to get started that you point back towards your existing network, because if it's your first foray into the interim world, generally speaking, the ISPs, although they are actively now looking at new interim talent coming through, they generally prefer that tried and tested, partly because of the fee profiles that are attributed. So from that point of view, I would look back to your network and see actually with your former employers whether there are some discrete projects that you could be involved with. And that will help to get your next chapter as an interim professional rolling. And Charles is nodding there, so he seems to be in agreement, which is good to hear. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Nick, there's a couple of statements from Nick, but I'm going to flip to your question. So how do we set a day rate? That's a old chestnut.
So what I would say is, so the annual IIM report, which I referenced earlier, has a few other interesting data points. One is about the sort of average day rates. And one of the things that report will do is give you a sense of how those day rates contrast across sectors, which is quite important. So, for example, if you have a view in mind of, say, 1,500 a day, then maybe the smaller end of the not-for-profits is not going to be the audience for you. But generally speaking, you look at your permanent equivalent salary. So let's say that was, I don't know, 180,000, just for argument's sake. You would effectively translate that by doubling it up and adding the 1,000, or what would the sums be on that? So that would probably be around, about 1,300 a day. So there's generally a margin uplift. I mean, Charles, to be fair, will have a much more accurate view on that in terms of what the day rate equivalent to a perm would be. But to me, they don't really compare, because you've got to cover your own holiday pay, you've got to cover other things yourself, and that all gets factored into, in essence, what becomes your day rate calculation. So I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Charles.
I would just add, so a couple of points. We've got a document on the website. I can't remember exactly where it is, but it gives you a methodology for doing exactly this. And I think the other point I would make, which was made to me right when I started many, many, many years ago, do remember that and the stats still say the same, the average interim working period in a year, average, is still in the 7 to 8 months space. So you need to make sure you cover for the period you're not working as well. Would be my other build. Wes, I think we've answered your question, or I think Simon's answered your question around the time to find a role for an interim acting solo versus with Morphosis help. I think that was quite clear in the table. One from Bruce. do you have a sense of how many ISPs to register in court? Too little or too many, and why? That's another old chestnut.
Well, interesting enough, on that earlier data table, the interesting thing is that the spectators, as we loosely call them, are generally gravitated towards almost a scattergun approach, and we're typically sort of trying to get on radar of 20 to 30, if not more. The reality is that when we work with those individuals, we then basically fine tune them down to those that are most relevant. On average, by the way, that's 7 individuals, not 7 firms. When you factor in, for example, the sector bias of that ISP individual, and also the functional bias of that ISP individual. So hopefully that gives you a steer there.
Okay. Last question on the list from Dean. Choke point 1 on LinkedIn. Can the filters like location and industry for his profile be corrected by himself? And if so, how?
Okay, so the location one, you control that. So that would be where you may want to think about not where you are, but where you would like to be. So, you know, if you're sat there, let's say in Aberdeen, and the sweet spot for what you do happens to be in London, then you may want to position yourself as London area, for example. As far as industry is concerned, you can't do that within the designated employers. But if you are trading as, for example, Simon Hudson Incorporated or whatever, Interim Services, then you can assign that to an industry. So that would be your first foray into controlling the flow on your employment experience. So let's say they were all manufacturing before and you wanted to be mechanical engineering, you would assign your consultancy business where you drop in some of the assignments that you've done to that sector or segment. The other thing I would say is that this is where skills become useful. So under your profile, a bit further down, you've got a list of skills. You can actually control that. So for example, with industry sectors, you can add them in and therefore attribute them to certain roles. So even if one company said they were manufacturing, but you wanted to infer more the mechanical side, let's say, of what they do, you would attribute the mechanical engineering skill that you've added to that particular employment experience. So you can connect them yourself, but it's a bit more sort of convoluted. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. One more question in from Nick. What are the 5 seminars you referred to?
So the 5 seminars are the 5 individual choke points. So that is one area that we impact. You'll also see on the IIM website, there's another collective of seminars, depending on whether somebody's at early stage in their interim career, mid stage of their interim career, or senior stage. But generally speaking, the 5 choke points are the 5 seminar topics. And from that point of view, you know, there would be a different level of interpretation whether somebody was at early stage or mid or senior stage. So we would recognize the tailoring to suit your own circumstance and positioning.
Okay, thank you, Simon. One more, which just came in, but it's come up with an anonymous attendee, so obviously their name is not registered properly. What, in your experience, is the average time between assignments?
Well, some interims actively take time off between assignments. So there is a skew to that, unfortunately, based on people's own preferences. What I would say is that the average time between assignments, unfortunately, if you don't have your house in order, there are more people spending more time off assignment. That period between assignments is starting to grow. And that's part of the reason why Morphosis Partners and the IIM work with each other, because if that gap becomes beyond what you are comfortable with, then ultimately there's an adjustment that you need to make. And so we can obviously talk with that individual, assess where the issues are, and look to, you know, remove that disconnect. But on that table of example, you'll see some people are off assignment for more than a year, you know, and that's not actually the stream end of our clients that we've supported. My attitude is that on interim assignment, your key skill is about recognizing quickly symptoms, provide a course of action. I would simply say that you should treat your assignment search with a similar leadership mindset.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Conscious we're just over time. We've had a couple of people drop off.
Yeah.
The last thing I will just briefly say, so IIM is the Institute of Interim Management. It's a representative body for interim managers. I will put it in the email that you'll receive with the link to the recording. There is an offer on at the moment if you want to join. The fee is only £160 a year, and there's a £40 application fee that is currently being waived with a code that you will be provided with if you want to join. And I'll put the link into the site as well. At this point, we need to close. So I wish to thank Simon very much. Sorry, dog problems. I will put the link in shortly. Thank you, Simon. Thank you to everybody attending, and you will receive an email in due course with the recording. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and thank you for the questions that you've contributed. So hopefully everybody's taken at least something away from this webinar. So thank you for your time.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye.